In 1952, the most powerful mafia family in New York buried Bumpy Johnson alive, sealed in concrete. 72 hours underground. No light. No water. No way out. He survived. And what he did next sent shockwaves through every crime family in the city. What did Bumpy Johnson do underground that made the entire Italian Mafia never touch him again? To understand how it all led here, we go back to where it truly began. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday evening, slipped beneath the door of Bumpy Johnson's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue like it was nothing more than a grocery receipt. No signature, no return address. Just a single card, cream-colored and thick, the kind of stationery that cost more than most Harlem families spent on dinner in a week. Embossed at the top in dark ink was a small crest, the unmistakable mark of Vito Genovese. And beneath it, written in clean, deliberate cursive, "Join me for supper, Friday evening, the usual place. Come alone." Bumpy Johnson read the card once, then he read it again. Then he set it down on the kitchen table with the careful, unhurried movement of a man who has trained himself never to react to anything in real time. He poured himself a glass of water, walked to the window, and stood looking out over Harlem as the last copper light of the afternoon faded slowly from the rooftops, and the streets below began their transition into evening. From 5 floors up, he could see everything. The corner boys who straightened almost imperceptibly when his car rolled past. The shop owners who kept their doors open late because his name on this block meant their windows stayed intact. The older women who sat on their stoops without fear because they knew that Ellsworth Johnson's protection extended over this neighborhood like a canopy, invisible to those who had never needed it, and absolutely real to everyone who had. He had not built that position by being careless, and he had not survived 3 decades in the most unforgiving city in the world by pretending that a piece of cream-colored stationery from Vito Genovese was simply a dinner invitation. Every instinct he had, and he had spent a lifetime sharpening those instincts against circumstances that would have broken most men before their 30th birthday, told him exactly what this card represented. It was not hospitality. It was architecture. Someone had designed something, and this card was the first wall. The question was not whether to go. The question was how to go in a way that preserved whatever could still be preserved. Vito Genovese was, in the winter of 1952, the most dangerous man in New York. That was not hyperbole or street mythology. It was a precise and accurate assessment shared by law enforcement, by rival families, and by the men who worked closest to him, who feared him with the specific, bone-deep fear that comes not from cruelty alone, but from intelligence applied without conscience. Genovese had survived things that should have finished him. He had navigated the collapse of the old Luciano organization, the fracturing of loyalties that followed, the constant pressure from federal investigators, the treachery of men he had trusted, and through all of it, he had not merely survived but consolidated, expanded, and strengthened his position until there was arguably no single figure in the American underworld who wielded more influence or commanded more absolute authority over the men beneath him. He was also, beneath the expensive suits and the carefully modulated voice and the surface performance of civilized restraint, profoundly territorial, and for years, Bumpy Johnson had occupied a piece of territory that Genovese wanted. Their arrangement, brokered through the architecture of the old Luciano agreements, had given Bumpy operational control over Harlem's numbers trade in exchange for a percentage that moved north to the Italian families. It was a compact, built on mutual necessity rather than mutual respect. And mutual necessity, as Bumpy understood better than most, had an expiration date. He had always known that. What he had not known, or perhaps had chosen not to fully reckon with, was how close that expiration date had crept. Genovese's problem with Bumpy Johnson was not fundamentally financial, though he would have framed it that way if pressed. The real problem was symbolic. Bumpy had become something in Harlem that went beyond the organizational role he was supposed to fill. He was beloved in a way that made the community around him difficult to manage from the outside. He was respected in ways that crossed racial and organizational lines. He was, most dangerously of all, independently minded, a man who made his own calculations, held his own counsel, and could not be reliably controlled through the usual instruments of fear or incentive. For a man like Genovese, who needed all the pieces on his board to behave like pieces, Bumpy Johnson had long since stopped being manageable, and things that could not be managed had to be removed. The elegance of what Genovese had designed, and Bumpy could see the elegance of it, even as its walls were closing around him, was that it required no public confrontation, no spectacle, no incident that would ignite the streets of Harlem or draw the kind of federal attention that nobody needed in 1952. Just a dinner invitation, just a quiet evening, just a man who walked in and never walked out, whose disappearance could be explained away as a retirement, a departure, a man who had decided the life was no longer worth the weight of it. People would grieve, people would wonder, and then, as they always did, people would move on. Bumpy spent 3 days thinking. He moved through Harlem at odd hours, taking routes he didn't usually take, varying the rhythm of his movements the way a man does when he is evaluating the perimeter of something he cannot quite see the edges of. He talked to no one about the card. He trusted no one with the specific gravity of what he was carrying, because trust in his world was a resource to be spent with the same deliberation you applied to every other resource, sparingly, strategically, never out of sentiment alone. He thought about his options, turned them over in his mind, the way you turn a stone to examine what's beneath it, and arrived each time at the same conclusion. There was no clean way out of this. There was only the choice between going forward with his eyes open or being found in a position he had not chosen. On Friday evening, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson put on his finest charcoal suit. He polished his shoes until he could see a version of his own face in them. He straightened his tie in the mirror for longer than the task required, studying the reflection of a man who had come a very long way from the boy he had once been in South Carolina, and thought, not for the first time, about how much distance a person could cover in a single lifetime if they were stubborn enough and smart enough and willing to pay the particular price that the world charges for becoming someone that other people cannot ignore. Then he walked out the door. The restaurant was on the Lower East Side, in a neighborhood that had been Italian for generations and wore that identity in the architecture of its buildings and the particular quality of its evening light. The place itself was the kind of establishment that communicated wealth not through ostentation but through restraint. Heavy linens, low lighting, the kind of service that anticipated needs before they were expressed. Bumpy had been here before. He knew which table was Genovese's, positioned with his back to the wall, commanding a sight line to both the front entrance and the kitchen corridor. He knew which of the men at nearby tables were dining and which were working. He catalogued all of it as he crossed the room, the way he always catalogued every room he entered, because the habit of reading spaces had kept him alive more times than any single decision he had ever made. Genovese was already seated. He looked up when Bumpy approached with the unhurried attention of a man who had been expecting him and had used the waiting time productively. He was immaculately dressed, a glass of red wine at his right hand, and he wore the particular expression that Bumpy had come to associate with him over the years, not quite a smile, not quite neutrality, something precisely between the two that communicated absolute control without committing to warmth or its absence. "Ellsworth," he said, "sit down. I'm glad you came." "You knew I'd come," Bumpy replied, settling into the chair across from him with the ease of a man joining a friend for supper. Genovese considered this for a moment, then inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I did." They ate, Or they performed the choreography of eating food arriving and being consumed. Wine poured and sipped. Conversation moving through its paces with the surface appearance of normalcy. Genovese spoke about business, about the changing landscape of the city, about pressures from law enforcement and the shifting loyalties within the broader organizational structure they both operated inside. He was engaging in the way that intelligent men are always engaging, capable of making you feel, in the moment, that the conversation that you were having was the most interesting one you could possibly be having. Bumpy responded where response was expected, volunteered nothing, and watched. He watched Genovese's eyes, which rarely moved from his face. He watched the men at the surrounding tables, noting the slight but consistent attention they maintained. He watched the waiters, whose movements had a precision that was slightly too rehearsed for ordinary service. He watched all of it and said nothing about any of it, because the one thing Bumpy Johnson had never been willing to give anyone was the satisfaction of knowing they had rattled him. The main course was cleared, a dessert menu appeared and was set aside, and then the lights went out. 4 seconds of darkness, no more than that. When they came back on, the room looked identical, same tables, same linen, same low music from somewhere in the back of the house. But Bumpy's wrists were secured behind the chair with a restraint that had been applied with practiced speed. And there were 2 men standing directly behind him who had materialized from somewhere in those 4 seconds, with the quiet efficiency of men who had rehearsed exactly this moment many times. A cloth had been pressed briefly against his nose and mouth, long enough to soften the edges of the room, to push everything back half a step into a slight, floating unreality. Not unconsciousness, but something adjacent to it. Something that took the sharp edge off his responses without removing his awareness entirely. Genovese had not moved. His wine glass was still at his right hand. He looked at Bumpy across the table with those heavy, unhurried eyes. And the expression on his face had shifted so slightly that most people would not have been able to name the change. But Bumpy could name it. It was relief. The particular relief of a man who has been carrying a decision for a long time and has finally, irrevocably, acted on it. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The dinner conversation was finished. The next chapter of the evening had begun, and it had been scripted long before either of them sat down. They moved him through the kitchen and into a back corridor that smelled of grease and cold air, then through a heavy door and into the night, into a waiting car that was already running. The whole sequence took less than 90 seconds and involved not a single raised voice. It was the operational signature of serious, experienced people, everything accomplished through preparation and timing. Nothing left to improvisation or noise. Inside the car, Bumpy could not see. He could hear. He listened with the focused intensity of a man for whom listening had always been a primary tool, tracking the sounds of the city as they changed around him. The dense rhythm of Manhattan giving way to the broader, looser soundscape of somewhere less populated. The drive lasted somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, long enough to cross into Brooklyn, long enough to reach the edges of it, where the streets grew quieter and the buildings grew older, and the darkness between streetlights stretched out longer. The car stopped on what his feet told him was gravel. He was walked across it, then onto concrete, then down a flight of stairs, 11 steps, which he counted automatically, because counting was something to do, and doing something was better than doing nothing. The air changed as they descended. It grew heavier and cooler, and took on the particular quality of spaces that have been sealed away from natural circulation for a very long time, the smell of old stone, of compressed earth, of concrete that had not seen light in years. They removed the covering from his eyes. The room was a rectangle, roughly 15 feet by 10, with walls of poured concrete reinforced at the seams with iron strapping that had gone dark with age. The ceiling was barely 6 inches above his head when he stood at full height. There was nothing in the room. No furniture, no fixtures, no source of light. No water. In one corner, an iron pipe ran from floor to ceiling, the remnant of whatever this space had originally served. The floor was bare. Uneven concrete, radiating the kind of cold that comes not from the temperature of the air but from the earth itself, pressing upward through the stone with patient, indifferent constancy. Near the top of one wall, a ventilation slot perhaps 8 inches wide and 4 inches tall admitted the only connection to the world above. Barely adequate for air, completely inadequate for anything else. Genovese crouched at that opening. His face appeared in the rectangle of slightly lighter darkness, like something glimpsed in a dream, composed, unhurried, utterly certain. Around him, outside the door at the top of the stairs, Bumpy could hear the sounds of welding equipment being readied, the specific hiss and pop of metal being prepared to meet metal. "You built something real up there, Ellsworth," Genovese said. His voice came through the slot with a clarity that felt almost surreal in the heavy silence of the room. 30 years. That is not nothing. I want you to know that I understand what you built." He paused. "But you and I both know that the city is changing. The arrangements that made sense 10 years ago do not make sense today, and a man who cannot adapt to new arrangements becomes a problem. You know this better than anyone." Another pause. Longer this time. "No one will find you here. No one will look. And in a week, when your people ask where you went, I will tell them you wanted out, that you were tired, that you chose peace." The ghost of something moved across his face. "They will believe it. People always want to believe the peaceful story." He stood up. He stepped back from the opening, and the welding began. Bumpy listened to it. He stood in the darkness of the room and listened to the sound of his exit being sealed, the hiss and crackle of the torch, the occasional dull clang of metal being pressed into alignment, the smell of hot iron drifting faintly through the ventilation slot. He listened until the sound stopped, until the footsteps above him receded, until the engines of departing vehicles faded into silence, and he was left in the most complete and absolute quiet he had ever experienced. No light, no sound, no way to measure the passage of time, no way to know whether it was night or whether dawn had already broken on a Harlem that did not yet know it had lost its king. He stood still for a long moment. Then he sat down on the cold concrete floor, placed both palms flat against the ground, and closed his eyes. Not because there was anything to see, but because it was a choice. And in a room designed to remove every choice from a man, the act of choosing even something this small, even something this quiet, was the first and most essential act of resistance available to him. In the darkness behind his closed eyes, something moved across his face that the men who had sealed the door above him would not have believed if they had seen it. Not panic, not the first fractures of a mind beginning to come apart under the pressure of total isolation. Something slower than those things. Something quieter, something that had been shaped, over decades, by every impossible situation Bumpy Johnson had ever found himself in and walked away from. He smiled. Not the smile of a man who did not understand his situation. He understood it completely. The sealed door, the inadequate air supply, the absence of water, the deliberate removal of every resource a person needed to sustain himself. He understood that Genovese had done this before, in one form or another, and that it had always worked before. He understood that the odds, measured by any reasonable calculation, were not in his favor. But Vito Genovese, for all his intelligence, and all his operational precision, had made one mistake. The only mistake that truly mattered in any of this. He had looked at Ellsworth Raymond Johnson and seen a problem to be managed, a piece to be removed, an obstacle that time and darkness and deprivation would dissolve. He had not seen, because seeing it would have required him to look at Bumpy as something more than an obstacle, what was actually sitting on the other side of that sealed door. He had not seen the mind that had navigated 30 years of situations designed to produce exactly this kind of despair, and had emerged from every one of them not just intact, but sharper, more focused, more precisely aware of the exact nature of the ground beneath its feet. Genovese thought he had buried a problem in the dark. What he had actually done was give a very dangerous man a quiet room in which to think. And what Bumpy Johnson began to think, alone in the absolute darkness beneath the streets of Brooklyn, would not stay in that room. It would rise, like everything that is buried too close to the surface, back into the light, and when it did, nothing in New York would be quite the same again. In the absolute darkness beneath the streets of Brooklyn, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson did not scream. He did not pound his fists against the sealed door, or throw himself against the concrete walls, or surrender to the particular madness that total isolation tends to produce in human beings who have not prepared themselves for it. He did none of those things. What he did, in the first minutes after the last sounds of the departing vehicles had faded into silence above him, was breathe, slowly, deliberately, with the precise, conscious intention of a man who understood that the air in this room was not unlimited, and that every breath spent on panic was a breath stolen from thinking. And thinking was the only resource he had left that no one could seal behind a welded door. He sat on the cold floor and he counted. 4 counts in, 2 counts held, 6 counts out. He repeated the cycle until his body stopped interpreting the darkness as an immediate threat and began, slowly and reluctantly, to settle into something that resembled functional calm. It was not peace. It was not acceptance. It was the deliberate, willed suppression of every instinct that would have made him less effective. Because Bumpy Johnson had learned across 40 years of surviving in environments designed to destroy him, that the most dangerous thing a man could do in a crisis was feel it before he had finished thinking it through. When his breathing was steady, he began to listen. Not for rescue, he harbored no illusions about rescue. He listened the way he had always listened in difficult rooms, with the focused, patient attention of a man who understood that every space communicated information if you were willing to be quiet enough to receive it. He listened to the quality of the silence around him, which was not uniform. There were gradations in it. The wall to his left returned sound differently than the wall behind him, a slightly duller resonance, as though the density behind it was not consistent. The ventilation slot above him carried air that moved in rhythms, faintly but detectably, suggesting an exterior that was not completely enclosed. The floor beneath him sloped, almost imperceptibly, toward the corner diagonally opposite from where he had been left. He catalogued each of these details without assigning conclusions to them yet. The way a chess player catalogues the position of every piece on the board before deciding which one to move. Then he began to build the room in his mind. He had seen it for perhaps 90 seconds before the darkness took it from him, and in those 90 seconds his mind had done what it always did, in unfamiliar spaces, photographed everything, filed it, held it available. The dimensions, the placement of the iron pipe in the northeast corner, old and fixed at both ends, the reinforcing straps along the wall joints, dark with age and running in patterns that were mostly structural but not entirely uniform on the west-facing wall, the smell of the place, which he now sat with more carefully, separating its layers the way a sommelier separates the components of something complex, cold concrete, compressed earth, and beneath both of those, Something older and entirely different. Something organic. The faint, unmistakable sweetness of wood that had been sealed from circulation for decades, but had not yet fully given itself over to rot. That smell was a question. He let it sit in his mind, and he listened to it, and he thought about what kind of answer it was pointing toward. And the answer, when it arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as the slow, inevitable conclusion of a chain of reasoning that he followed link by link with the methodical patience of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing else to do. Wood meant timber framing in a sealed underground space in this part of Brooklyn. In a building of the age he had estimated from the concrete quality on the stairs, meant one specific era and one specific purpose. The years between 1920 and 1933, when federal prohibition had turned the production and distribution of alcohol into the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history, had produced in Brooklyn a network of underground storage facilities built by men who were serious, organized, and professionally sophisticated about one thing above all others: they needed exits that law enforcement did not know about. Every substantial storage operation from that era had been built with the same cardinal requirement: a secondary passage, a way out behind the obvious walls, accessible quickly and quietly when the front door became unavailable. Bumpy had not known, when they brought him here, that this room had a history, but the room had told him, in the language of smell and sound, and the particular way its silence had texture and variation, and he had been listening carefully enough to hear it. He began with the walls, starting from where he sat and moving systematically around the room on his hands and knees, pressing both palms flat against each section of concrete and moving them in slow, overlapping horizontal passes from floor level upward. He was not looking for a door in any obvious sense. He was looking for inconsistency, a seam that ran in a direction the structural logic of the room did not require, a section of wall that returned pressure differently than the sections surrounding it, a place where the careful, deliberate uniformity of poured concrete revealed a seam that had been filled rather than formed. He worked in complete darkness, entirely by touch, with a patience that could not be measured in minutes because he had stopped measuring in minutes. There was only the work and the information the work produced. The first wall yielded nothing useful. The second wall was uniform. The third wall, which was the one he had spent the least time facing in those first 90 seconds of light, was where his right hand found it, a vertical seam running from 18 inches above the floor to approximately 5.5 feet up, where it turned at a precise right angle and ran horizontally for just over 3 feet before turning again and descending back toward the floor. Not a crack, not a structural irregularity, a rectangle, deliberate, constructed, and concealed beneath decades of grime and the careful application of matching concrete fill that had been smoothed by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to stay hidden. He found the release mechanism 20 minutes later, a section of the iron reinforcing strap on the left edge of the rectangle, whose lower end was not fixed to the wall but hinged, and behind which, in a recess packed with what had once been grease and was now a thick, gummy residue the consistency of cold tar, sat an iron lever approximately the length of his forearm. He had nothing designed as a tool. He had a shoelace, a nail he had worked free from the remnant of an old timber shelf fragment near the base of the wall, and 40 years of experience reading spaces and the people who built them. He used the nail to scrape the worst of the residue free. He used the doubled shoelace to clean the pivot point of the lever until it moved without resistance. He wrapped his jacket around his right hand, braced his left palm flat against the wall, and pulled. The door did not open easily. It had not been opened in perhaps 20 years, and the earth on the other side had pressed in against it with the patient, a cumulative weight of 2 decades. It moved in fractions a millimeter, then 2, then a slight fracture of the seal that sent a thin blade of cold air through the gap with a sharpness that hit Bumpy's face like a physical thing, like something he could hold on to. He pulled again. The door moved. He repositioned, changed his angle, drove his weight backward from his heels, and something gave way with a sound like a long, slow exhale. And the door swung inward 3 feet and stopped against the accumulated debris of the passage beyond. 3 feet was enough. The crawl space beyond was low and narrow, its walls lined with the collapsed remnants of wooden shelving that had mostly surrendered to time and moisture. The smell of old timber was immediate and strong here, and the air moved faintly but consistently in the direction he needed to travel. He moved through the passage on his hands and knees, feeling ahead in the darkness, following the movement of air the way you follow a sound you are not yet sure you heard. The passage rose slightly. Then it turned. Then it ended at a wooden panel that gave way with a single, firm push, swinging outward on hinges that had somehow retained enough function to move. And Bumpy Johnson emerged into a narrow alley between 2 warehouse buildings under a sky that was dense with cloud and faintly luminous with the ambient glow of a city that was always, somewhere, still awake. He stood in that alley, and he looked up at that sky for a long moment. He breathed the cold air of Brooklyn in the hours before dawn, and he felt the particular quality of a man standing on the other side of something that was supposed to have been the end of him. Then he straightened his jacket, checked that his shoes were still adequately tied, and walked out of the alley toward the nearest street. There was no dramatic music, no waiting allies, no moment of triumphant revelation. Just a man in a ruined suit walking through a quiet Brooklyn street in the deep of night, moving with the unhurried, purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. He found a diner 4 blocks away that was open and occupied only by a short-order cook and a cab driver, nursing coffee at the far end of the counter. He sat down, ordered eggs scrambled, toast, and a large coffee, and ate his meal with the focused, genuine appreciation of a man who has not eaten in 3 days and understands that the body requires fuel before it can do what is about to be required of it. He did not call anyone. He did not explain himself to the cook, who glanced at his condition with visible curiosity and the professional discretion to say nothing about it. He simply ate, drank his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked back out into the night. The decision he made in the hours that followed was the one that would be talked about for years in the places where people who knew this world gathered and spoke carefully about the things they had witnessed. He did not go to any of the safe locations he maintained across the city. He did not contact a single member of his organization. He did not reach out to anyone who might have helped him plan a response to what had been done to him. Instead, he went home to Edgecombe Avenue, walked up the 5 flights of stairs, ran a bath, and spent an hour in it. He dressed in a clean suit. He made himself a proper breakfast at the kitchen table, sitting in the same chair where he had read Genovese's invitation less than 2 weeks before. And then he picked up the telephone and placed a call to a number that very few people had and even fewer had reason to use. The message he left was 4 sentences. He wanted a meeting with Vito Genovese. He would come alone. He asked only that Genovese extend the same consideration. He believed the meeting would be mutually beneficial. The response came within 90 minutes. An address in Lower Manhattan, that same evening. The room where Genovese received him was a private office above a social club, dark wood paneling, heavy furniture, the accumulated atmosphere of serious decisions made over many years. 3 of Genovese's most trusted men were positioned around the room with the practiced casualness of people who are working. Genovese himself sat behind a broad desk, and when Bumpy walked through the door, something happened in that room that none of the men present would have been able to name precisely, but all of them felt with complete certainty. It was not fear. Fear was too simple a word for it. It was the specific, deeply unsettling experience of watching something walk through a door that the laws of reasonable expectation said should not have been capable of walking through any door ever again. Genovese looked at Bumpy for a long moment without speaking. His face was composed. His hands were still, but his eyes moved across Bumpy's face with a rapid, searching quality that betrayed the single thing happening beneath the composure he was recalculating. Urgently and completely. He was recalculating everything. "Ellsworth," he said finally, "sit down." Bumpy sat. He placed the envelope on the desk between them, folded his hands over it, and said nothing. He was in no hurry. He had demonstrated, more conclusively than any argument could have, that he had time. Genovese looked at the envelope. He looked at Bumpy. He reached for it with the deliberate movement of a man who has already understood that whatever is inside it is not going to improve his evening, and opened it. He read the contents in silence. His face did not dramatically change. He was too controlled for that. But his breathing shifted, and beneath the immaculate surface of his composure, something moved that Bumpy had never seen there before in all the years they had occupied the same dangerous world. Something that Vito Genovese, by his own self-conception and the self-conception of everyone around him, was not supposed to be capable of feeling. The envelope contained documentation assembled over years of patient, invisible intelligence work, the financial architecture of the Genovese organization laid out in precise detail, account numbers and intermediary names, and the locations of facilities that existed in no official record, the identities of 2 individuals inside federal agencies whose cooperation had been purchased and whose exposure would produce consequences that no amount of money or influence could contain, and attached to the front of it, in Bumpy's own handwriting, a brief explanation that complete copies of everything in the envelope were currently in the possession of 3 individuals in 3 separate cities, with standing instructions to deliver their contents to federal investigators if Ellsworth Johnson failed to make personal contact with each of them before the end of every Sunday night without exception. Genovese set the papers down on the desk with the careful, deliberate movement of a man handling something he now understood to be extraordinarily fragile. The room was completely silent. The 3 men along the walls had not moved. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small thermos. He poured 2 cups of tea, set one in front of Genovese with the easy, unhurried courtesy of a man hosting a perfectly ordinary meeting, and lifted his own cup. He took a sip. He set the cup down, and then he looked at Vito Genovese with the open, steady attention of a man who has absolutely nothing left to prove, and therefore absolutely nothing left to fear. "You buried me underground," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without anger. The way the voice of a man is quiet when he has already moved past the emotion and arrived at the conclusion on the other side of it. "I want you to know I understand why. A man in your position makes the decisions his position demands. I have never expected anything different from you." He paused, picked up his cup again, set it down. "But I had 3 days down there with nothing but time and silence. And in that silence, I thought about how much I already knew about your operation. And I thought about how long I had known it. And I thought about the fact that you never once considered that possibility." He looked at Genovese steadily. "That was the only mistake that mattered." Genovese said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every instrument of leverage he possessed, every mechanism of control and consequence he had spent a career assembling, was sitting in a sealed envelope on his own desk, held by a man he had tried to erase from the world 3 days ago, and who had walked back into it wearing a clean suit and carrying tea. "Harlem stays as it is," Bumpy said. "Our arrangement stays as it is. and you and I never revisit this subject again." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and picked up his thermos. "I think that's reasonable. I think we both know it's reasonable." He looked at Genovese one final time, not with triumph, not with contempt, but with the level, clear-eyed look of a man stating a fact that requires no elaboration. "Thank you for the meeting. Vito, enjoy your evening." He walked out. The door closed behind him, and in the room, he left. Vito Genovese sat for a very long time without speaking, looking at the envelope on his desk, while the three men around the walls waited for instructions that did not come. Genovese lived for many more years after that evening. He would go on to navigate trials and verdicts and the slow erosion of everything he had built. But the men who were in that room on the night Bumpy Johnson walked back through the door would say, in later years and in careful company, that something ended for Vito Genovese in that moment. Some foundational certainty about his own invulnerability that once cracked, never fully repaired itself. And in Harlem, where the story eventually arrived in fragments and whispers and the particular way that true things travel through communities that have learned to read between the lines of what they are told, people began to understand that the man who had come back from wherever he had been was carrying something new. Not just survival, something larger than survival. Something that was about to change what Bumpy Johnson's name meant, not just in the underworld, but in the world above it. Harlem noticed his return the way it noticed most important things, not through announcement, but through feeling. No motorcade, no gathering of men on corners, no deliberate display of the kind that lesser figures use to remind people of their continued existence. Bumpy Johnson simply reappeared in the neighborhood the way a season returns gradually, then completely. His presence restoring something to the air of the streets that people had not known was missing until they felt it come back. He walked the same blocks he had always walked. He stopped at the same places. He spoke to people with the same unhurried attention he had always given them. But those who knew him well enough to look closely, the ones who had been watching his face for years and had learned to read its subtle registers. The way you learn to read weather saw immediately that something had changed, not in his composure, which remained absolute, not in his manner, which was as measured and deliberate as it had ever been. It was in his eyes. There was a quality in them now that had not been there before. A particular kind of stillness that belongs specifically to people who have been to the edge of something irreversible and come back from it carrying the knowledge of exactly how thin the line is between being here and not being here at all. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in that sealed room beneath Brooklyn. He never offered an explanation for his absence or a story that accounted for the days when no one in Harlem could find him. In the world he operated in, silence on a subject was itself a form of communication, and the silence Bumpy maintained about those 3 days communicated, to those who understood how to listen, everything that needed to be understood. He had been tested by something that was designed to be unsurvivable, and he had survived it not by force, not by luck, but by the quality of his mind and the depth of his character. That was the story, even without words. That was what people read in his eyes when he walked back into Harlem and resumed his life. But the resumption was not a simple return to what had been, what the darkness underground had given Bumpy Johnson. Beyond survival was clarity, the particular, irreversible clarity that comes when a man has sat alone with nothing and discovered that what remains when everything external is removed is either enough or it is not. For Bumpy, what remained had been enough, but it had also revealed to him, with the precision of something seen under very strong light, the exact dimensions of what he had been building and what it was ultimately for. Power. He had understood in that room with a completeness that intellectual understanding alone could never have produced. Was not an end. It was an instrument, and an instrument pointed at nothing is simply weight you carry. In the years that followed, Harlem watched Bumpy Johnson do something that no one in the long history of the city's underground had done in quite the same way. He turned the instrument toward the community that had always been the true source of whatever he was. He funded the education of children whose families could not fund it themselves. He established systems informal, unwritten, but absolutely understood by everyone they applied to, that protected the most vulnerable people in the neighborhood from the various forms of predation that institutional neglect had left them exposed to. He intervened in situations that the official structures of the city had no interest in resolving. He created, through the accumulated weight of his reputation and the careful application of the influence he had spent decades building, a kind of informal justice that operated in the spaces where formal justice had never bothered to go. Was this the work of a criminal or a community leader? Harlem was never particularly interested in resolving that question. Because Harlem understood, with the practical wisdom of a place that had survived a very long time on very little, that the categories available for answering it had not been designed with Harlem's reality in mind. What people knew was simpler and more durable than any category. They knew that when they needed help, and the systems that were supposed to help them looked the other way, there was a man on Edgecombe Avenue who did not look the other way. That knowledge was what made Bumpy Johnson a legend while he was still alive to be one. The end, when it came in the way that things sometimes end for people who have spent their lives in motion suddenly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary moment that had given no indication it intended to be the last one. It was the summer of 1968, and Bumpy Johnson was at Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue, seated across a chessboard from a man he had been playing against for years. The game was deep into its middle stages, and Bumpy was winning not dramatically, not through any single decisive move, but in the patient, structural way he had always won at chess, building advantages so gradually and across so many dimensions simultaneously that his opponent often did not fully understand the position he was in until it was already too late to change it. Bumpy reached across the board, moved a piece, sat back, and was gone. No final words, no dramatic last gesture. Just a man at a chessboard at the end of an evening, and then the particular stillness that is different from all other stillnesses. The board remained as he had left it. No one moved the pieces. People who came to see it in the hours afterward stood looking at the position on the board with the quiet, searching attention of people trying to read a message in a language they almost understand. The pieces were where they were. The game was where it was, and anyone who knew chess well enough to evaluate the position could see, without ambiguity, that the man who had just left the table had been winning. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was 62 years old. He had survived things that were designed to be unsurvivable. He had outlasted enemies who had dedicated serious resources to ensuring he did not outlast them. He had built something in Harlem that no amount of opposition from outside or pressure from above had ever managed to fully dismantle. Because what he had built was not made of money or territory or organizational structure alone. It was made of the trust of people who had very few reasons to trust anyone, and that was the one material that could not be seized or transferred or negotiated away. They had buried him underground to end his story. They had sealed the door and walked away confident that darkness and time would do what they had been unable to do through any other means. What they had not understood, and what the years that followed demonstrated with the quiet, irrefutable authority of lived history, was that you cannot bury a man whose story lives in the people around him. You cannot seal away a legend. You cannot cut off the air supply of an idea that a community has already breathed deeply enough to carry inside itself. The ground beneath Brooklyn had not been the end of Ellsworth Johnson. It had been, as he himself had perhaps understood in the moment he sat in that darkness and allowed himself to smile, the beginning of the truest version of him, the version that Harlem remembered, the version that could not be touched by anything Vito Genovese or anyone like him had ever had the power to do. They put him in the ground to finish the story. What they could not have known, what none of them ever fully reckoned with, was that the story had only truly begun down there. In the dark, in the silence, in the place where everything unnecessary falls away. And what remains is exactly what a person is made of at the very center of themselves.